The AEC were a series of armoured cars that were developed by the British during the Second World War. This was done following experiences that were picked up in the deserts of North Africa. During the early stages of the fighting, the British had had huge successes using armoured cars to outfight the Italians during Operation Compass in particular. British armoured cars and light tanks, despite being quite badly outnumbered, had performed almost a British blitzkrieg on the Italian army and had routed it out of Egypt and most of Libya simply using fast moving tactics. The issue was, however, was that most British armoured cars in service at the time were armed with machine guns. This had resulted in members of the army in North Africa simply jerry rigging captured Italian and German 20mm weapons onto their vehicles so that they could keep up the fight and engage enemy armoured formations. At the time, the Italians and the Germans used a wide variety of armoured cars to perform their own reconnaissance and to, in some cases, even support infantry contingents. And at the time, Britain was using machine guns. A lot of these guys were using heavier autocannons. So Britain had already realised that this was kind of an issue and had begun development on the Daimler armoured car. The problem was that the Daimler was taking an awfully long time to proceed. There were other things that were deemed more important, and so its development had taken a considerably longer time than had been hoped for. As a result of this, it was not going to be ready until about mid 1941, meaning at the start of the North African campaign there just weren't any for service. Another problem was that the Daimler Benz was armed with a 40mm 2-pounder gun. By mid 1940, late 1940, getting into 1941, everyone is sort of realizing that the 40mm 2-pounder gun is kind of obsolete, and they were looking to try and replace it with something better. The problem in the case of the armored cars, however, was that no one was looking to develop a new machine to sort of combat these issues that had been raised. AEC itself as a company was not a major contractor, for the military, that is. They were a manufacturer of trucks and bus chassis for the most part, and they did produce the Matador artillery tractor. This is a truck which is used for towing medium artillery and heavy anti-aircraft guns. Besides that, however, they didn't build much of anything which the army actually wanted. The initial venture into developing an armored car was actually made by the company privately. They developed a mock-up vehicle, which was shown off to army officials in 1941 at the Horse Guards Parade in London. This was seen by Winston Churchill, who was impressed enough with the design that he ordered 120 machines pretty much immediately. Now, when designing the vehicle, AEC had had two main points of interest. To start with, the machine needed to have both the firepower and the protection, which was comparable to those contemporary British cruiser tanks of the time. In this case, we would be looking at the Crusader Mark I. This would be the 40mm armed Sherman, relatively decent armour, and it needed to basically fall into those requirements. Several prototypes were sort of drawn up around this time. The initial version, or what would become the Mark I version, essentially used a Valentine Mark II turret with a 2-pounder gun in it. Again, this gun was becoming obsolete, but at the time there wasn't any other turrets available. Other versions would begin slowly being made over time. A custom turret would be built for the latter versions, and this would then be used to host either the 6-pounder gun or the 75mm American gun. This was then also fitted with a coaxial Besser machine gun and a 2-inch bomb thrower, which was used for lobbing smoke grenades. Mark I vehicles were also given a Bren-like machine gun on the roof, which was used for defense against aircraft, while later versions would receive what was known as the PLM mounting, and this was designed to be fitted with Vickers guns. They could be fitted with either one or two guns. The turret itself was electrically driven on all models, but it could be manually operated when it was required of it. The engine was an AEC design. Again, this is a vehicle which is built by the company which builds truck chassis, and the AEC Armoured Car is built on those truck chassis. Two engines were utilised. Originally, there was the AEC 195 diesel, which was used in the Mark 1s, and then the Mark II and 3 used the 197 engine of the same name. The challenges of the changes in the two power plants were dramatic. The 195 produced only 105 brake horsepower, compared with the 197's 158 brake horsepower. Both engines were good enough for the job of powering the AEC, with the armoured car able to reach speeds of up to 41 miles per hour on flat ground and roads. Armour is actually rather considerable. It did change over time, but in the between 1941 and 1943, the latter versions were being armed with up to 65 millimeters or 2.5 inches worth of frontal armor. Even the early versions were armed surprisingly well, which meant that there was actually at the time no armored car in the field that the Germans were using which could actually penetrate the frontal armor of the AEC unless they were firing armor-piercing composite rigid rounds. You have to remember that in the Germans' case, they're all using KWK-30s. This is the 20mm cannon you find on a Panzer I. It's not going to punch through much armor. It was sort of obsolete when it entered service, and it continued to be obsolete long after it really should have been retired. So the Mark I first goes into combat in late 1942 during the North African campaign. This is around the time that the Second Battle of El Alamein occurs, and the British and Commonwealth armies break the Germans. They then start to run back across the desert. They run out of Egypt. They run through Libya. Then they don't really stop. AECs were sent in pursuit of these forces. They would first see real combat during the week-long series of skirmishes which made up the El Galia battle. This is about a week's time. This is like a week where the Germans basically try to fight a series of rearguard actions as Rommel tries to desperately get his army out of a trap that Monty is planning. Monty's plan does fail, however, due to mix-up in communication issues, there's planning problems. They underestimate the resolve of the Axis to fight, to hold the line, and their flanking effort just gets bogged down. During this time, it has been reported that some of the 8th Army actually began to jerry-rig the AECs. By jerry-rigging, they were removing the Mark I Valentine turret, and they were replacing that with a Crusader turret. Now, by this point, the British are using the Crusader with the 6-pounder gun. So they were taking the 2-pounder weapons off the vehicles and putting the 6-pounder Crusader turrets on board. It seems like a bizarre thing to do, but Royal Engineers, you give them any option, they will jerry-rig something together. So AECs would then be dragged into the fight in Europe, and they would actually be used alongside US Lend-Lease Staghounds in British armoured car companies. Now, in 1944, armoured cars were placed into an armoured division's reconnaissance regiment, and these were part of the Royal Armoured Corps. These were designed to be the forward eyes of British armoured formations, which in Normandy was very, very important, considering the fact that your only other reconnaissance was air power, which is a problem when the Germans are hiding in every bush line they can find, and also when the Germans are planning on ambushing you every 5 minutes, having something light or lighter than a tank and more mobile, but able to deliver some firepower is kind of handy to have. It was also rather important to note that at this point the Germans had finally picked up on the heavy increase in armoured car firepower. In 1940, the Germans had been fielding machines like the SDKFZ 231. This was a slow, bulky 6 or 8-wheeled armoured vehicle with a 20mm cannon on board. They also had what we call the Panzerwagen, or the SDKFZ 221 or the 222. These are the two differences between these two is the one has an MG34 or 42 and the other has a 20mm cannon. None of these were a threat to a 1944 AEC design. Of course, they wouldn't have been a threat to most things that the Allies were fielding by that point. They were still used, of course, because Germany was going to use whatever she could get her hands on, but they weren't particularly good at that point. By this point, however, the Germans had begun to phase them out. In 1944, the biggest and most powerful armoured car formations that the Germans had were fielding the SDKFZ 234. This is a series which uses 20mm cannons, 50mm cannons, and 75mm weapons, depending on which series you are looking at. This is also the 50mm version is known as the Puma. It's the very famous Puma, which everyone either loves or hates, depending on how badly you play War Thunder. This once again gave the Germans the ability to match British armoured reconnaissance. The problem was is that the Germans weren't using their recons in quite the same way the British were. The British were much more for find a good position, camp, hide, call in artillery on the nearest target. The Germans would tend to use theirs a lot more in a more dangerous, more get forward, start combating enemy forward elements, then break off and report contact. So the AEC was used all the way through to the end of the war and would continue to be in service until 1958 when it was replaced by the Alvis Saladin. So thank you very much for watching today. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe, comment down below if you have any thoughts and feelings on this topic, and whatever video you'd like to see next. Many thanks. I'll see you soon.